because you don't understand that introverting functions are subjective and extroverting functions are empirical. Because socionics has this asinine, underlined, and in neon dichotomy called external-internal. So if thinking is external and does not need to be reinterpreted, why are there ever misunderstandings between people? Why is it that books and texts can be read many different ways? Why is it that the same person can read a book differently with different experience 5 or 10 years later? Why? Because language, and people know this in semiotics, people know this in semantics, people know this in linguistics, the word is not made flesh. If you believe the word is made flesh, that is logocentrism. And it's a logocentric belief to believe that thinking that when one person says something, that you automatically understand what the other person means. So if you say, here's an example, such and such has giant blank. You say to the belief. The other person then looks and says, you said they were giant. That's not giant in my book. Oh, I suppose your giant is a bit bigger than my giant. So the whole meaning is not transferred across. There's an objective, there's an empirical part to that, like big means big, but how big is big? Or various words where, so for example, if a word was exactly the same as the meaning, then you wouldn't need discussions in a book on the poetics on what Aristotle meant by catharsis. And you wouldn't have people misunderstanding the poetics the way they did. So, for example, I read the poetics after reading Story by Robert McKee. And I know that if I had read poetics before McKee, I would have read it differently. Because I had that background knowledge. So there's also context. So basically, language is not purely external. It's external enough that we can understand each other mostly. But there's still losses of misunderstandings. So that is the subjective part. But the signifier is not the same as the signified. The word is not the same as the meaning. So, for example, if I say the word iwa, what does that mean? If thinking doesn't need to be reinterpreted, I'll give you the word ear, you should instantly know what that means. But of course we like Ben, that's how language works. And if I was to say iwa means character, do you know what that means? And this is in the Yoruba religion, the religion of the Yorubas. You might think, oh, I've got an idea what character means. And it's like, yeah, but what it really means, though, what it's pointing to, what the sign is pointing to, is really Iwa. Character in the Yoruba religion is very SFJ. It's like selfishness and not being generous to other people is really frowned upon, and people would be ostracized, sort of being selfish. And so for them, character is really, it was completely different from what I expected when I started reading the article on this philosophical article on what Iwa is. Yeah. And it's like, oh, this is all pretty standard stuff. This is like, don't steal, don't break a covenant. Like you're listening, ENTPs and ESTPs, don't break a covenant just because it's inconvenient. You stay to your word. So anyways, my point there is you don't get all of that from Ewa. And even the way I've talked about it, if you actually talk to someone who's actually in it, they'll have a different understanding from me. So thought is not completely external. So this, again, it's an asinine dichotomy, just like sensing is not completely external. Two women look at the same man. One might be turned on, the other one might throw up. Their sensory experience of the same man is different because sensing is bound up with the emotional reaction to it. That's why there's a phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That would be the subjective part of sensor, an example of the subjective part of sensor. An example of the empirical part would be maybe objective standards of beauty. But you can sort of go it with, like, if you looked at someone's taste and people having different taste in something, where it's like, or different taste in music, and it's like, are we really experiencing the same thing? Or it's like, we're experiencing the same thing, but in a different way. There's a subjective component there. Yeah, and so there's also something else I've heard about from an information socionics point of view, is that introverts refine. Oh, refine. And how do they refine? Do 10 introverts who are, say, TI DOMs all refine in the same way? Are they likely to say that? No, they're going to refine in a idiosyncratic way. Oh, if the refining is idiosyncratic, it must therefore be subjective. So maybe I should use the word idiosyncratic. Introverts are idiosyncratic. The extroverts are more empirical. So the TI DOM will be idiosyncratic in its thinking. The FI DOM will be idiosyncratic in its feeling. And NI certainly is idiosyncratic. And SI, again, it can be idiosyncratic. All right, it's like, oh, it's got lovely hairy legs. Or if someone has a fetish, like idiosyncratic. So, and this matches what we see in real life. You know, in real life, sensing and thinking are not totally external. And you would have to eliminate thinking. You'd have to say thinking, which is to say thinking is external and doesn't need to be reinterpreted. It's like, well, how do you communicate? How do you pass thinking to another person without telepathy and without language? So you'd have to go towards very specific, tiny parts of thinking, which are very, very small percentage of thinking, which is like pure logic, which then you can say that doesn't need to be reinterpreted. That would be the same, like to anyone with sufficiently high IQ, that follows that and will always follow that. But most thinking is not like that, and there's no need to pretend that TI is logic. Logic is a separate thing. It's just that TI apes the form, the structure of logic to make it more convincing, because INTP is looking for, because the thinking is subjective and abstract, in order to prove it, it's looking for consistency, which is what I'm doing now. It's like I'm saying, this is consistent with this, that is not consistent with that. And so in doing that, it's going through the reasoning power. If you say this, it predicts this, and therefore that. This is where the reasoning power comes in. If you're typing an ISTJ as an LSI, there are consequences to that I can falsify, because you're saying that it's going to have this kind of interaction style, this kind of romance style, and it's like, I can then follow up on that and see if that fits what is predicted. And then it's like, well, is the function map of LSI fit in the person in front, or does the function map of SITX fit better? And then I can make the case based around consistency. You've mistyped this person because your type image is wrong, because you've defined the functions incorrectly. And then I can say, whereas the way that the functions are defined in the SITX is consistent with the affect display, the intertype relations, the correlates to the Kersey intellects, and to the socially intelligent roles that are the intellects. And it's like, try to find an inconsistency there. Whereas I found 11 here. 11. Right. So let's go with Trump. Why